Hello and welcome to this video podcast for evolution and diversity. In this video podcast, we're going to focus on the non-vascular plants. I'm going to begin with some key characteristics of non-vascular plants, and then I'm going to talk about the three groups of non-vascular plants: liverworts, mosses, and hornworts. As we get started with this, I want to go over three quick terms that you've learned in the past, but I'm going to ask a question in a moment that's going to require you to remember these terms. And all three of these are related to our analysis of phylogenetic trees. The first is monophyletic. So remember that a monophyletic group shows members that descended from a common evolutionary ancestor and includes all descendant groups. A paraphyletic group, remember, includes groups descended from a common evolutionary ancestor, but does not include all descendant groups. So that's the key between a monophyletic and a paraphyletic group. One includes all descendant groups, the monophyletic group does, and the paraphyletic group does not include all descendant groups. Polyphyletic. This is when you're looking at groups that were descended from more than one common ancestor. So over here, when I'm circling, shows you our three domains: bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. And one of the kingdoms of eukarya are the plantae. And in the last video podcast, I talked about some of the key adaptations that all plants had to have to meet certain challenges they were presented with when they colonized land. And now what I want to do over the next 4 days is talk about different groups of plants. And today we're going to talk about the non-vascular plants. And then in the next 3 days, we'll talk about seedless plants, gymnosperms, and angiosperms. These last three, seedless plants, gymnosperms, and angiosperms, are considered vascular plants. And we'll talk about these all quite a bit later, but today we're focusing on the non-vascular plants. And so I want to ask two questions for you to consider. The first, are plants as a group monophyletic, paraphyletic, or polyphyletic? Next, I want to ask, are non-vascular plants monophyletic, paraphyletic, or polyphyletic? If you need to, go back and review the terms and then hit pause and try to answer that question. And then when you think you have the answer to both of these questions, go ahead and hit play again. So let's answer this first question. Are plants monophyletic, paraphyletic, or polyphyletic? Well, it's best to think about what is that common ancestor of plants. And we can see here we have that common ancestor that has that very critical synapomorphy of the ability to live on land. And you can see that when we talk about plants, they all come from this one common ancestor. And it includes all plants. It includes all land plants, as shown by the bracket here. But within that, it includes the vascular plants, seedless plants, gymnosperms, and angiosperms. So because of that, we would say that plants are monophyletic. Now, are non-vascular plants monophyletic, paraphyletic, or polyphyletic? Well, again, we look at this common ancestor to the non-vascular plants, the liverworts, the mosses, and the hornworts. And then we have to ask, does it include all of the descendants from this common ancestor? And the answer is no, because this is the same common ancestor that we talked about before that gave rise to these three groups of non-vascular plants. But this common ancestor also gave rise to seedless plants, gymnosperms, and angiosperms. And because of that, the non-vascular group of plants has to be paraphyletic, because it does not include all the descendants from this common ancestor. All right, now that I've shown you how non-vascular plants are a paraphyletic group, let's now move on to the first objective of talking about the characteristics of non-vascular plants. Now, some of these characteristics, in fact, many of these characteristics are going to be similar to what you saw when we talked about the overall characteristics of land plants. Some of these I'm just going to remind you about, and others I'm going to spend just a little bit more time talking about them. The first is they have a cuticle. And we talked about this before, and so I'm not going to spend too much time on this, except just to remind you that the cuticle was really important because it's this waxy covering of the plant cells. And this helps to keep the plants from drying out. And remember, this also led to, and then remember when we talked about the cuticle, we said that indeed it did keep the plants from drying out, but it had the consequence of preventing proper gas exchange, allowing CO2 to enter into the plant cells for photosynthesis. So plants developed these pores, and we called these pores stomata. And these stomata, remember, allowed CO2 into the cells, but they also allowed water to leave the cells. And this wasn't necessarily a good idea because that kind of prevented the purpose of having the cuticle. Now, sometimes water leaves the cells, and that's fine. But you don't want there to be this constant leaving of water from the cells, as we talked about before. And just to remind you, what kind of helps regulate whether CO2 comes into the cell and water leaves the cell at these stomata were the guard cells. So don't forget our guard cells. Remember that the guard cells regulate the opening and closing of the stomata. The third feature that we see in the non-vascular plants are these flavonoids. And remember, the flavonoids protected the DNA in the plants from UV damage. So the more UV that the plants are exposed to, the more flavonoids appear in the plant cells because it protects the plant cells from the DNA damaging characteristics of ultraviolet lights. All right, and the fourth one is that non-vascular plants have primitive water conducting cells. This is one of the keys to them being non-vascular. They don't have vascular tissues. They don't have a system of tubes that allows water to be transported over long distances. And that's one of the reasons that non-vascular plants are much shorter and closer to the ground. And in fact, we probably should just list that here as another characteristic of non-vascular plants, and that is that, as I just said, they are shorter, closer to the ground. In fact, let's just look at a few examples that we'll talk about in a little bit more detail in just a moment. But if you look over here on these pictures, you see examples of the mosses, the liverworts, and the hornworts. And you can see how they're all pretty small and short to the ground. And that's because the soil that they're resting on contains the water they need. And since they don't have an elaborate set of tubules to move that water over long distances, they have to remain close to the ground in order to gain that water. And because of that, the cells within these non-vascular plants are capable of absorbing water. And because of that, plant cells of non-vascular plants have to have the ability to absorb water and nutrients. And I want to introduce one more term here as you're looking at these non-vascular plants. How is it that they stay attached to the ground? They don't have like this elaborate root structure that you're familiar with other plants, but they do stay attached to the ground. And they stay attached to the ground by structures called rhizoids. And so let's go back to the whiteboard here and list that as a characteristic of non-vascular plants, and that is that they have rhizoids. And as I said, rhizoids attach non-vascular plants to the ground, or it could be to a rock, just attaches it to some substrate that of course is going to be near the water. Okay, the rest of the characteristics I want to talk about with non-vascular plants have more to do with reproduction, and so I'm going to erase this and move on to a fresh whiteboard. All right, as I said on the last whiteboard, the remaining characteristics that I want to talk about associated with non-vascular plants is more related to reproduction of the plant. And so this seventh characteristic I want to talk about is the fact that non-vascular plants have a flagellated sperm. In non-vascular plants, the sperm still has to find a way to swim to the eggs through water. Another reason why the non-vascular plants are smaller and closer to the ground, because this allows the sperm to be able to swim to the egg when there's small drops of water placed on the plant, such as small drops of rain or a small puddle or something like that. The eighth characteristic I want to talk about is that the gametes are produced in a multicellular organ. This multicellular organ is called the gametangium. In plural, it would be gametangia. More specifically, eggs are produced in a structure called the Archegonium. And the plural of that is Archegonia. The sperm are produced in a structure called Antheridium. And then the plural of that is Antheridia. And we'll come back to these in a moment when we talk about alternation of generations. All right, this ninth characteristic is that embryos are protected and nourished by parental tissues. And more specifically, this parental tissue that they're protected in is the archegonium. Inside this archegonium, the sperm fertilizes the egg to produce the zygote. A zygote, if you recall, is a one-celled embryo. The zygote then develops into a multicellular embryo. And a very important feature here is, as the embryo is being developed, it receives all of its nutrients from this archegonium. Because of this feature of the embryo, developing in the parental tissue and being nourished by the parental tissue. We call plants embryophytes. This is very analogous to the way you might think of how mammals develop inside of the amniotic sac inside of the mother. And the 10th characteristic I'd like to talk about is alternation of generation. Now, alternation of generation isn't a structure or a feature that we see in non-vascular plants or other plants, but rather it is this pathway, this process that occurs. Now, we've talked about alternation of generation before, but remember, alternation of generation is this process of alternating between a gametophyte and a sporophyte. Remember that the gametophyte is the multicellular haploid stage. And remember, haploid is represented by one N. The sporophyte is the multicellular diploid stage. Now we'll see that some types of plants are dominated by the gametophyte stage and some are dominated by the sporophyte stage. In non-vascular plants, it has a dominant gametophyte stage. And really what I mean by that is that this is the longest lived stage. Most often when you see a non-vascular plant like a moss on a tree, what you're seeing is this gametophyte stage. This gametophyte stage also provides most of the nutrients for the different non-vascular plants. Now I want to briefly go over this alternation of generation in non-vascular plants, and to do so I'm going to use a figure from your textbook. Okay, so let's go ahead and begin our discussion of alternation of generation in non-vascular plants. You'll see down here we have the mature female gametophyte, represented by one N. And then rising from the top of it is the mature sporophyte, the diploid stage, shown here. And this is what it might look like if you came across it in the woods. All the green base down here is the gametophyte stage. And then you'll see these stalks coming off here that represent the sporophyte stage. All right, now within this sporophyte structure here, through the process of meiosis, these diploid cells will produce haploid spores. These haploid spores will now continue to divide by the process of mitosis to form these early multicellular structures. Remember, these are still all haploid. They will continue to divide by mitosis until they produce mature gametophyte structures, one female and one male. Within this male gametophyte, we have the antheridia. Remember, that is the reproductive structure that produces the sperm. As it produces the sperm, they then will move to the female gametophyte structure by swimming in water, either a droplet of rain or puddle or something like that. And they will swim ultimately into the female reproductive structure, the Archegonium, where the egg is being developed. They will then fertilize the egg and they will form this zygote, this one-celled embryo. And now this one-celled embryo will continue to divide by mitosis until it forms the mature female gametophyte here. And then, extending from the mature female gametophyte, you'll have the sporophyte stage once again. And the whole process will repeat itself. The benefit of learning this process is it kind of tells you a story. And by telling you a story, it will help you remember some of the important vocabulary as well as some of the important processes. It'll help you remember what the sporophyte and the gametophyte stages are. It'll help you remember the name of the male reproductive structure and the female reproductive structure. Remembering this story will hopefully help you remember that sperm still have to remain in water in order to swim to get into the Archegonium. Okay, that's all I want to say about the different characteristics of non-vascular plants. I'd now like to move on to our second learning objective for today. And remember, the three groups of non-vascular plants are the liverworts, the mosses, and the hornworts. As I talk about each of these three groups of non-vascular plants, I'm going to mention approximately how many different species exist within each of these groups, and I'm going to mention a few features about them and the relevance or some interesting things about them. But let's begin with the liverworts. So let's go ahead and start talking about these non-vascular plants, as you see here. In our next class, we'll talk about the first of our vascular plants, the seedless vascular plants, and then we'll talk about the gymnosperms and the angiosperms, the ones that produce flowers and fruits. But let's go ahead and begin talking about the three groups of non-vascular plants. The first one here, the liverworts, are fairly abundant. There are about 8,500 species. Some of them have a liver-shaped leaf, and that's how they get their name. I'm not sure if that's really liver-shaped, but maybe somebody feels that's liver-shaped, so I'll give them the benefit of the doubt. But all of them don't have this liver-shaped leaf. One thing that sets the liverworts apart from the mosses and the hornworts is that their rhizoids, shown down here in this diagram, is only a single cell. So you can see it here, it extends all the way down here, but it's just one cell. And as all rhizoids, it helps in absorbing nutrients and water, but it also helps in attaching to various substrates. They have pores like we see here, but they're less advanced than what I've described before. So they're not exactly stomata, they're stomata-like. So they can allow for CO2 to enter into them, but the downside is they don't really have the ability to close. And so water can freely leave through these pores. It's not a huge problem for them because there's residing on top of wet soil, and so they can obtain a lot of nutrients in that way. They probably resemble what the first land plants were, at least as best as we can estimate. Their decay, when they die and begin to rot, it helps form soil. So they're very important in initializing the formation of soil. Let's talk about the mosses. The mosses have about 12,000 species. Now, unlike the liverworts, the rhizoids on the mosses, shown here, are multicellular structures. The leaf structures on them, shown here, are only one cell layer thick. So their cells can absorb water, but they also have some very primitive water-conducting tissues. Not the complex vascular tissue that we're going to talk about next. Not the complex vascular tissue that we see with the vascular plants, but they do have this primitive water-conducting tissue. Unlike the liverworts, the mosses do have a stomata, and you can see an image of the stomata here. This one, of course, is open, and this one is closed. So they are able to keep water inside of them, and so they are able to resist drying out. In some cultures, large patches of these mosses can form what we call peat, and when this is dried up, it can be used as a fuel for cooking and heating. It's not the most efficient, but it does do the job. Finally, let's talk about the hornworts. There's not quite as many of these. There's only 19 species. Like the mosses, they have a multi-celled rhizoid. Their leaf-like structures are also one cell layer thick. They have these primitive water-conducting cells that the mosses have. What sets them apart is that they have stomata on these photosynthetic sporophytes. Here are those photosynthetic sporophytes down here. And finally, some hornworts form a symbiotic relationship with cyanobacteria, our good friend from way back when. And when they are in this symbiotic relation, the cyanobacteria help fix nitrogen. Okay, that is all I have for this video podcast. If you have any questions at all, make sure you come see me. If not, I will see you in class. Bye for now.